All right, welcome to the House Education Committee, everybody. We are here on May 20th, 2025 to discuss some federal funding impacts for the state library. And we are joined by the Commissioner and State Librarian for the Vermont Department of Libraries. And if you could just introduce yourself and take it away.
My name is Catherine Del Mayo, and I'm the State Librarian and the Commissioner of the Department of Libraries. Thank you for inviting me here today. I can give you some information that I've shared with you in some documents today, and then I can answer your questions. So just to point out the documents as before I get started, you have a programmatic budget that shows the splits between our state funding sources and our federal funding sources. And there is also a one-page spreadsheet that shows the way in which different staff in the department work toward the different programmatic elements. And for a really quick overview of what the Institute of Museum and Library Services federal funding provides for Vermonters at their public libraries and throughout the state through the department. There's this piece as well, which many of you may have seen in your local public libraries. I'm really glad to be here today and to have an opportunity to provide you with an update. You may have seen information in the news about some threats to the Institute of Museum and Library Services at the federal level. I wish I could tell you that everything is resolved at this point, but it is truly the case that things are still evolving in that space. To give you a quick overview of the impact of that funding on the department, the funds that we receive annually through the Institute of Museum of Library Services Technology Act Grants to States program make up roughly 1/3 of the department's budget. And those funds are used in almost everything that we do to support library services in the state of Vermont. And as you can see, if you look at our program budget sheet, the largest chunks of money go toward the electronic information resources or the databases, and also toward the interlibrary loan and courier program, which is something that we do to support resource sharing between libraries in Vermont and also to bring materials from out of state that we don't have access to in Vermont here for Vermonters based on their information requests. We also do some cultural programming, largely through a partnership with the Vermont Humanities. We grant funds to them to do the really popular Snapshot series. We also support some youth programming with these funds, including the Teen Lit Club. We do a lot of continuing education for library staff and consultation for library staff and trustees throughout the state. In fact, when we had a working group on the status of libraries in Vermont, we heard very clearly that that service is a really key service that we provide. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to meet with, I think, 300 librarians at the Vermont Library Association, and we graduated 35 folks in our Certificate of Librarianship program, which is something that in statute that we are charged with administering. So it's a really important resource here in Vermont, and it's something that my staff do directly, both training and then setting up courses for with external subject matter experts for the library community. And we do that primarily because many staff in libraries in the state, in public libraries, don't have a master's degree in library science. And so they don't have that formative background and understanding of the profession. They're very service-minded and they want to do well. And so what they'll do is they'll sign up for the certificate program and get a great foundation from the training offered by the staff in the department. And then they go out there in the world and just do great things, especially in our small and rural communities. We see that that's a very prominent way in which folks are trained. I believe that only about 15% of the public libraries in the state have any staff with a master's degree in them. And those are largely the more suburban communities, the bigger communities, and focused around those largest libraries in the state. So for decades, the department has been receiving federal funding, and it has been used in conjunction with our state funding to provide the suite of services that people know us for. And our services are really aligned very well with our state statute. What we shall do in statute are the things that we're required to do. So this funding from our federal funders even goes towards things like materials for our correctional facilities and psychiatric facilities. And that's all broken down, and I can answer questions that you may have about that. Typically, we've been seeing funding in the range of $1.24 million. And I believe this coming year, we will see that again. We had at first been very concerned. Well, we're still very concerned, but we had been extremely concerned on March 14th of this year when we saw an executive order that really pointed to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, said it was unnecessary and that these funds should not be granted out, should only be granted out at the statutorily required level. And then we waited for quite a while to hear clarification. The IMLS staff were almost all released at one point, and then some of them have come back. There are 2 court cases in play right now, one that our Attorney General here in Vermont signed on to with other 20 or 21 other states. There have been some recent injunctions around that, saying most recently that the funding needs to be restored and the staff need to be brought back. I heard this morning that the staff are getting messages that they're coming back. That wasn't an official message, but I heard it through the state librarian grapevine, which is quite an interesting grapevine. But then about 10 minutes later, I heard from the executive director of the state librarians group, the chief officers of state library administrative agencies, that the federal administration has filed a stay on the injunction, and the acting head, the interim director is named Keith Sonderling, that he had issued a statement. So I just saw that this morning when I was getting materials ready for our conversation today. The statement that the interim director filed with the courts does say that we will be getting our funding this year. So this is the fiscal 2025 allocation. We have received notice already that we had been granted a partial award for half of the money. So that notice came to us about 2 weeks ago. The information in the court document today, which they haven't shared out with state librarians officially yet, that statement from the acting director says that they plan to release the full, what we would imagine to be about 1.24 million for Vermont and the other states. So I'm hopeful that we have the funding that we were planning on when we submitted our fiscal 26 budget, and that we can continue next year as planned. I do have concerns that if there were any rescissions to the federal budget, this is certainly something that the administration, the Institute of Museum and Library Services keeps showing up with a zeroed out budget in various Trump administration budget proposals, both in his first administration and now again in his current budget proposal. So it's something that the zeroing out has happened before, and IMLS has survived. So I'm hopeful it will continue to survive, but it's certainly not clear what our funding would be for next year, for next fiscal year. And so we're really just waiting and seeing. At this point, I do have a grant award notice for a partial award, and I'm hopeful I'll get another notice for the remainder of the award. But that's kind of where we are right now. Which doesn't, I know that that sounds like something and nothing at the same time. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, and to do my best to explain how we use the funding if you have questions about that.
As far as the timing, you said you are going to have half of it released or half the money will be released. What's typical? Do you usually get it? Is the timing typical? Like, do you usually receive it earlier than now? And is it usually like a lump sum, or?
We usually receive a notice of the full allocation earlier in the process. It's usually not early enough for us to say definitively what that amount will be for our upcoming budget. But by this time in the year, we typically would have received the full allocation. The explanation that we've had from both that I've heard from heard from IMLS staff, and then I also saw it in the declaration that the interim director filed with the courts today, I think yesterday, was that their budget is still being evaluated. So the delays with the federal budget that went into March, that's what they're pointing to for why this hasn't come in a full allocation amount yet.
I apologize for coming in late, so you may have already covered this, but so you've got a 16.4 million one-time grant that is ARPA dollars, and in this, at least ARPA ESSER dollars that are in the school world are being clawed back and haven't been fully liquidated yet.
Mhm.
And is that an issue as well with these dollars?
Not to my knowledge. We have not heard anything like that. These funds are encumbered. They've been awarded for the $16.4 million Treasury capital projects funds have been encumbered for 14 projects here in Vermont. Some of the projects have completed and we've paid them out, or are in the process of paying out the final amounts, but we have not heard that. My understanding is that both the Treasury $16.4 million that larger award at the Treasury level and the Housing and Urban Development Award were on a list of programs that were to be looked at for compliance with EDI. And that was many, many months ago. And then that directive was repealed and we haven't heard anything further. So we're proceeding as if the money is in hand. And in fact, the $10 million US Department of Housing and Urban Development, after 2 years of sending paperwork back and forth to all different people throughout HUD, I finally was issued a grant award agreement this past March. So that's a pretty recent document. So I'm hopeful that means that the funding is secure.
How much does the state, what is your annual state appropriation?
So for the department, hold on. That was the one question I wasn't on, but I can tell you because I have this giant binder. So our budget. Our total state appropriation that we requested is split correct. So the governor's recommended budget is 3.9 million, and of that, a little bit more than 1.24 is what we were anticipating from the federal government. There's a small amount of designated funds like the Smith Fund, which are earmarked for youth services. And then as far as the general fund, it's 2.37.
So the federal dollars are a big portion of your annual budget.
Yes, 1/3.
Yeah.
And that's actually, that's customary. And I think it's probably because there's a match and a maintenance of effort requirement with these federal funds. So when I look around colleagues around the country, even a state that's as large as Texas, which receives a $12 million grants to states allocation, they have a corresponding 2/3 general fund that matches that. So I think that the manner in which the department and Vermont have been using these funds is pretty consistent throughout the country. We see that interlibrary loan is something that is a key service that departments of libraries are providing. Databases are a key service that departments of libraries are providing. We do more in the continuing education space, from what I understand, than many other state libraries. And I think that's a feature of not having a local library school, but also the low costs of, or the low wages for library workers in our state. So people can't afford to go to library school. They wouldn't be able to repay it. But a lot of what we're doing is very similar to what other states are doing with the money. And this type of split is very similar to what others are seeing. And there are other state libraries that have also gone after and obtained some of the discretionary grants from the Institute of Museum and Library Services for things like digitization or other programmatic activities. Some of those state libraries are, you may have seen news stories about some of them needing to release staff that were administering the discretionary grants, because the majority of the discretionary grants issued by the Institute of Museum and Library Services were just The Grants to States program where we get our funding is, I'm not an attorney, but my sense is it's a statutorily required, that they're statutorily obliged to administer the Grants to States program. And so that was one that they did actually cut 3 states funding entirely. And they cut it for 2024, so mid-stream on the spending. Those 3 states were Connecticut, Washington, California. That funding has been restored at this point.
Why were 3 states singled out?
That's a great question. There was some activity after the presidential election and before March 14th, in which 30 states were asked to look at their 5-year plans. I want to be sure you know that we're working a 5-year plan. It's been approved through 2027, started in 2023. Institute of Museum and Library Services approved all states' 5-year plans, plus the territories that receive their funds. Those 3 states, like Vermont, had their awards approved and had their plans approved, and they were just working their plans. Some states, 30 states, were asked to look at their plans and look at the language in their plans and remove certain language from their plans. Vermont was not asked to look at our plan. We really are always thinking about our programs in terms of serving all Vermonters and getting services to those who need it the most. We hadn't singled out kind of buzzwords in our plan. We wanted it to be in plain English for folks. So we were not asked to look at our plan. At least one state that refused to look at its plan or refused to change language of its plan, New York, didn't have its grant revoked. So it's really not clear. The executive order on the 14th of March stated that the acting interim director of the IMLS was to give a report and give a plan for how they would go about achieving the executive order. If they ever completed that report, they've refused to release it to anyone. I've asked for it personally numerous times. There have been FOIA requests, not by me, but by others in the library field, that have been denied. And in the court cases, their attorneys are in the hearings are saying they don't have a plan. So it's a little bit hard for us to anticipate what may be coming. And we don't want to be fear-mongering. So we try to answer the questions based on the information we have. I do think that there will be a lot of discussion around funding for IMLS in the upcoming budget at the federal level. And I am concerned that if we don't receive that federal funding, that the regular core services that we provide to Vermonters could be impacted. And it's also important to note the funding hasn't been going up. If you look at the documents that I share, the funding has actually decreased a little bit over time. And $1 million of it is the base. And then the additional money on top of the $1 million is based on the cost of the Gale databases doesn't go down. The cost of materials and the cost of supplies don't go down. Many of our books are printed in China, so one would anticipate if these federal trade issues don't resolve the costs of the materials, we might get less for our dollars here in Vermont with physical materials. Percentage-wise is the IMLS federal funds pay for about 36% of our staff overall. It's different amounts for different staff members. Like there's no money from federal funds toward my budget or my executive staff assistant, but overall, for the 18 staff of the department. We're paid the department staff are paid 64% out of general fund, 36% from the IMLS funds.
Yes.
Thank you. It's hard to hear some of this because the fear and worry is clearly on everyone's mind. My question is, if we see a reduction or elimination of some of this grant money, who do you think, from your perspective, will be hit the hardest? Who, or I should say, where or what? Where is the harm going to take place the most?
Well, I think it will most impact the small and rural communities. If the department didn't have sufficient funding for the databases, for example, and we had to cut those electronic resources, which are being used primarily by our students in schools, but they're used by elementary, middle, high school, and then our colleges are also pointing to those resources, and then our public libraries. I think that the universities might be able to find funding for that, maybe. The large public libraries might cut some nice to have database or nice to have service like Canopy, or they might cut back on the number of ebooks they're purchasing in order to have core electronic database resources. But at a small rural public library, they don't have something extra. They don't have that flexibility to make a budgetary decision to cut the nice to have and focus instead on the necessary. And really, when I look at the environment right now, I was just talking with colleagues yesterday at the library conference, and you go online and you get the AI results and they're wrong. And then you wonder about that. And then you switch to web. And then you're looking through kind of the same information repackaged in 7 or 8 different ways. That's what the internet looks like for me as a librarian. I think that's what it looks like for you and the Vermont public. So the databases in that environment are really important. And the reference services that are provided by librarians are really important. And reference services are something that the other state librarians and I have been really seeing people aren't always aware of. And we've been talking about how to get that feature of public libraries to be more top of mind for folks. So that's an area that we really want to push, and really want to push some of our continuing education and encourage Vermonters to get reliable, vetted, factually accurate, historically accurate information, rather than just sort of reading the top AI results, which I think is how a lot of people are sort of being fed information right now.
Could you give an example of a rural library providing that service? A person walks in and says to the librarian, what, for example, and then the librarian does what, for example?
So it's a grab bag. They could be asking anything, and that's kind of the joy of the library. So somebody might come in with a medical question. They just went to the doctor and they've heard that they have prediabetes, and they know that they should do something. They got the test, maybe they got the test result released before the doctor's appointment. They're trying to figure out, what should I even talk to the doctor about? A librarian using the internet would be looking maybe at WebMD or the NIH sites, or looking at some of those vetted, trusted resources. But right now, that's a little bit different, right? So some of the federal information could change. So the librarian might also refer somebody to a set of medical articles and journal articles within the Vermont Online Library, show them how to get into that database, show them that these materials were published in, the New England Journal of Medicine, so we can trust these resources. And really try to do that educational piece sort of one by one on the fly. But that could play out in any of the various, people come in, a lot of times people don't even know the question. And that's something in library school that we talked about a lot, like that they come in with a question, but it's not the question. And you have to try to figure out with them through that conversation, what is the question? So to me, when people talk about, we don't really need a librarian to provide reference services, or we don't need a vetted database, that's a little bit of a strange notion, because so many times as humans, we don't have a broad view of the field of knowledge and where the resources might be. And so I think for people who have less educational attainment, people who are not able to afford access to resources themselves. Somebody who wants to read the New York Times but doesn't have money to pay for the subscription, that's who would be using our databases. So that's what we're trying to maintain service to. One thing I should mention while you have me, is the interlibrary loan services are really important in our state. And we are a net borrower, which means sometimes you can look at winning one of these rankings and you think, wow, that's great. We really know that the other states have these resources and we go and we get them. My staff placed the hold on materials for interlibrary loan. They put the requests in for anything outside of Vermont to bring it to Vermonters. We're up there with North Dakota and I think Washington, D.C. as being the top net borrowers year after year. What it actually means when I look at that stat is that our collections in Vermont libraries are not deep. It means that if you went to your local library and you had a specific question and you needed a research item, you may not be able to find it at one of the academic libraries in the state. You may not be able to find it in your public library locally. And then we have to go to another state and ask, may we please borrow it? If our interlibrary loan system isn't funded, that would limit your ability as a Vermonter to do that without paying fees as an individual potentially. Libraries used to do a lot of charging individuals, $25 per interlibrary loan, which you really get an equity issue there. But think about nationally if the whole system crumbles. If Ohio isn't able to if their system falls apart and they can't send the books, if New York doesn't have funding to send the books, there are a lot of materials moving around all the time. And this is sort of, as I said to the librarians gathered yesterday, they do such a good job. People don't see all the hard work. I think that people aren't really aware of the systems and the structures that are supporting basic information access and intellectual freedom, the freedom to look up whatever you're interested in and get those resources brought to you. So I think it's, to me, this money is really important from the federal end. And if it goes away, it's still important to find a way to provide these services to Vermonters. If the funding were cut, then I'd have to work with my team to identify to what extent we could maintain services that were required to by statute. That would look like cutting the offerings, the collections. I don't like to think about any other cuts to personnel, but it's pretty impactful. And the good news is that for right now, it looks like we have at least half a year's funding, as long as there's not a rescission effort to change the allocation, because Congress could change the allocation. And from what the interim director is saying in the declaration that he filed with the courts yesterday, they're planning on giving us the full allocation.
Is the interlibrary loan, is that accessible for every library in the state, or what's the criteria?
Interlibrary loan is something that I hope all libraries in the state are participating in, and all of them certainly can. There's a courier system, which is an opt-in thing on top of interlibrary loan. So rather than sending materials through mail, it's more cost effective for those individual libraries to use a courier. We have a contract through OPC and VGS. They set up a contract with Priority Express, and I think it's 200, trying to think of the exact number, 228 libraries in the state participate in that. Most of them, of course, are the public libraries, but then some schools, the academic libraries. UVM actually just joined our courier, which took a couple of years, but we were really excited about them joining when the Vermont State Universities left the courier.
We really appreciate the update.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to come anytime. And if we have more information and you want to hear in the future, just let me know. Thank you.